what are we going to do? I was thinking about how to approach it and reconsidering it given your backgrounds and experience. And I thought we'd first go through that article, which is in your materials. And the reason, it's just a chapter out of a book by Robert Tricker. He's written quite a lot on corporate governance. And it's quite an interesting chapter that just describes the evolution of corporate laws. The reason I think it's relevant is if we look at it, we can understand why the Companies Act 2013 is shaped the way it is, the Indian one. And we can also see how the concerns that have been expressed through time have been echoed again and again when crises occurs. So I want to first discuss that. And then there are a couple of problems that are put together to discuss how the company law can regulate and what it can regulate. And then I wanted to have a little talk about self-regulation. So, forget about that. That's the end of that. So I now wanted to go on to discuss this particular article, if I may, with you. Just as a side, you'd asked me about the questions for the essay questions. I've put it together in the study guide, in the new materials. You'll find some examples. All right. So let's have a look at the chapter, and let's just think about what it is that Tricker is talking about. So what Robert Tricker's doing here is, as I said, he starts off and says, well, look, let's look at it from, the 16th century, and let's see how it evolved. So maybe to start the discussion off, I should ask some leading questions, which is to first say, we'll start off with something close to home, the East India Company. And he talks about the East India Company and how it was established by charter. So so the question is, how was it designed and what was its purpose at that time? And this discussion is on page 5. So I hate to kind of pick on people, but maybe we can establish a code where I can ask someone to answer the question or to start the discussion off. And if you don't want to, you can just say pass and it can go to the next person. And don't feel in any way, I know you won't, feel embarrassed if you haven't read it, but it'll be a shaming process, obviously. And that's the intention. So don't feel embarrassed, but you will really. So hopefully then you'll read next time. That's the aim of it, right? That is also a corporate regulation. A prize if you've done the right thing, shaming if you haven't. Corporate regulation. All right, so I'll start off with you. Oh no, do you think I'm picking on you? Okay. East India Company. What did you think Tricker is getting onto? What's he saying? And how did it work for you?
There was a guild of that person, a guild who made for the tailors and jute and all these cotton and all this. So they established a company, East India Company, to trade co and frequently with the England and to trade with other countries. So basic motive of that company is to get the structured form of that transaction or to get a structured form of that business. So basic thing is that.
Okay, so maybe I can just ask you, who are the shareholders? Britishers. Who gave the license for it to start? The East India Company.
Was it created by a charter that gave a monopoly to trade all over?
Okay, so a royal charter from the Crown, the British Crown, which established it. And it was basically a form of colonization, wasn't it? So, but it proceeded to say how different companies evolved to trade in different areas. Can you tell us something about that?
Here they have mentioned just like East India Company, which had its base in England. Similarly in Europe at that point there was a fight for prominence and to gain more wealth. So similarly all different rulers at different places which you mentioned are I can say Dutch East India Company, West Hudson Bay. So basically they did the same thing. They created a charter, a
Okay. So how many shareholders were there?
In East India Company, there were 1,000 shareholders
1,000.
and no board of directors.
Okay. How does it compare with a company now? Is there any company that has that format anymore?
No. Here it is a legal monopoly, whereas legal monopoly in India exists in the form of railways, which is still a legal monopoly, but yeah, it is very scarce.
All right. Okay, so it did seem to be an idea of trying to encourage some kind of growth. So using a corporation as a way of economic growth. And the idea of having different companies, the Hudson Bay and the Dutch and so forth, dividing it up, the African, Indian markets, seemed also to be a way of trying to allocate risk like multinational corporations do. So it might be one corporation, but they'll have subsidiaries that operate in different areas. So the notion that you can have one entity, but it can partner with different people, joint ventures, to try to work in different areas is something that isn't so new. The next thing that this mentions is that seemed to be working really well, but it goes on to tell us about the South Sea Company and what we've all heard of, which is the South Sea Bubble. Now, what happened there? And this is quite interesting as well to see how it's relevant today. Again on page 5. On page 5, the South Sea Company, incorporated in 1711. Do you want to just tell us what happens in that paragraph? What are they talking about?
So it says that, when I got to the reading, the House of Lords gave monopoly to the South Sea Company on the understanding that they would guarantee the British national debt at a fixed interest rate. That was followed with a lot of speculation, and the stock prices went up quite a bit. I think from £100 to over £1,000. And then a couple of scandals came to light. The Chancellor of the Exchequer seemed to have taken bribes to inflate the stock prices artificially, and when the bubble did burst, it led to a massive upheaval in the economy. A lot of people lost their money.
So the difference between the East India Company and this bubble, this South Sea Bubble Company, is that in the East India Company there were only 1,000 shareholders, or stockholders as they called them in those days. The idea of a share still hadn't been invented. The idea of stock is that you had a portion of the company, part of the stock. So the notion of the share as we know it wasn't there. It was slowly evolving. With the South Sea Company, as you've correctly said, okay. The idea that a shareholder can have a share in the company, usually, if you have a share in a company, it doesn't mean you can walk in and take the chair of the company. You don't have a share of the assets. You just have the right to vote, usually, and the right to receive a dividend if it's allocated. You don't have anything else. It's not really a property right as we know it as far as personal property of the entity is concerned. But it's a right to share if that happens. It's a contract. And the contract says you have certain rights and it only gives you usually the right to vote. Does that make sense? That idea hadn't existed before. They didn't really know what it meant. They actually thought 1,000 people actually had a share of the whole company before. They thought joint stock company meant everybody was putting capital in to the company and they thought they owned a share, a portion.
Stockholders conveys the sense that a person holds some physical assets.
So in those days, now you can view it as stock being much wider than shares, debentures, derivatives. You can have a whole lot of different kinds of property that comes under the definition. But in those days, they thought it was connected to a joint stock company, which meant you all joined and put your money in, so you had a share of the company. But the idea of a portion of the company, but the idea of having anything to do with the assets of the company disappeared in time. Does that make sense? But in those days, you're supposed to have a slice. So what's interesting in this case is, in the South Sea case, is that it was trying to get a whole lot of other people involved in investing in the South Sea Company. The reason it had such a massive effect on the economy is it was no longer just 1,000 people or 1,000 entities. It was widespread. Everybody wanted to get into the action because the price was going up. So everybody went in and bought shares, but as it says, much like Enron, much like Satyam, much like all those cases, big fraud. They were actually bribing the politicians in South America. They got caught for fraud. So because of all that, the company actually went broke. So, but it was still a speculation that was happening. And also the other idea is the government was trying to use a company to take the government's debt, much like Fannie Mae, which happened in the crisis just before the GFC crisis, where the government entities actually went broke in the US. And the government had to, they were supposed to be privatized, they were corporatized entities, but the government had to rescue them by buying the debt. Much like they've done in Ireland not so long ago, the government has to come in to help the companies and rescue them, much like they had to do in the GFC. So what we're seeing is the relationship between a company and the government is quite strong. In this instance, the government was using the company for its purposes. That soon changes. But in this instance, the government was using it to buy its debts. But even now we know that governments try to get companies to do all their infrastructure projects, right? They give them a whole lot of concessions. So they still get corporations to do that kind of thing, to do the government work. So the main points that I really wanted you to think about is, in this particular 17th century, the only notion that was coming up was the idea of a separate legal entity. That's all that was developing. Limited liability hadn't really come into effect yet. But separate legal entity was coming into effect. And we see that there was the ramifications of political intrigue, and we see that shareholders are getting ripped off. However, during the 19th century, as it says in the next section on page 6, the French and the British introduced the notion of a limited liability company and gave it to all shareholders. So I really wanted to ask you how you think, I know this is a bit of an obvious question, how you think or why you think that might have been, why did they do it? Okay, maybe just I'll ask you, what is the, you all understand obviously the advantage of limited liability. Okay, let's go on there to the US. The discussion here is talking about how in the US, the idea of limited liability wasn't so easy. They were struggled with this a bit more. Do you want to tell us what that was about?
Clash of federal versus state laws, and states claimed that it was their mandate to regulate the incorporation and the functioning of a limited liability corporation, whereas the federal government had passed
I think they wanted to regulate.
Yeah, they wanted to regulate it, and the US Supreme Court had overruled a case on the incorporation of the Royal Charter of India.
All right.
And so there was a clash of whose mandate it was to regulate the incorporation.
So the point that's being made there is the state governments and the federal government in the United States both wanted to regulate it, which is a recognition of the amount of power that they wanted to regulate and also the money they get from regulating it. Right? So Delaware in the United States, you would all have heard of, is the place where 90% of companies are regulated because they don't actually hit the directors with too many duties. So the idea that there is a market for investment and you can create a market where companies can run to and put their money, tax-free, that kind of tax-free jurisdictions and so forth, is not new. Already here, the state governments wanted to regulate it and they were trying to grab that opportunity. So the point that has been made here is, firstly, there was this tussle, but also in the United States, the companies were being used to further social good. The companies were being used for railways, and they were being used to provide roads, so infrastructure. So the limited liability wasn't introduced until the 19th century in the United States. But the point that I suppose I want you to recognize is it slowly evolved, and over time, the idea of separate legal entity is the first thing that came about, and then this idea of limited liability. The next period, I suppose, is the one that's the really exciting one for us, and that is talking about the separation of ownership and management, or operations, as it calls it. Maybe firstly I should ask you, why does that matter? How does the company look if, let's first say, how does the company look if the managers and the owners are the same? Anyone? So how many owners can you have if all the owners are managers? Only a few, right? So it has to be really a private company where there's one manager or there's a few managers. Really, the biggest it most probably gets is about 200, where you can have everyone employed in some way. Right? Much like your definition in your act of the small proprietary company being up to 200. So that idea of a private proprietary company is something that maybe should be different from a public company. But the point that I'm trying to really make here is if you have ownership and ownership and control in the hands of the same person, perhaps they're responsible for all the decisions. So should they have limited liability is really my question.
Limited liability in terms of the amount which is due, which is not paid. It is not regarding to their decision making and all this. It is regarding to their shareholding.
All right. But if they have 200, if they have 10 shareholders and all the shareholders are directors, right? And all the directors have stolen money. Okay? And all the directors have stolen 100 lakhs each. But they've only put 1 lakh as capital, and it's paid up capital. That's
we are talking about the limited liability of the limited liability. It is also only about at the time of the binding of the company. The unpaid amount of your shareholding capacity is to be paid at the time of the binding of the company, not at the time of the decision of the company. Either the board members, it may be rational that the board members may be wrong, but it is not regarding to their decision now.
right.
Limited liability.
Right. Anyone else? The question is, Is that reasonable? Why not?
Because they are inherently taking the money and taking the advantage of the
All right, so it's just a basic point that's being made, and yes, they're taking advantage, and they know what they're doing at every step of the way. So, yeah, I agree. And fraud is an important example under the Act now. Yeah. So under fraud, you could certainly catch them. Yeah.
The owner in this case would be the majority stockholder.
Well, yeah, every shareholder or stockholder will be an owner.
If that group of people own all the assets of the company and they're also responsible for the management of the company, I don't think that limited liability is the right way to go, because they are solely responsible for the functioning of the company, both in terms of assets and providing capital, as well as how the company carries its function. So it's not correct.
Anyone to oppose that?
I mean, I would say it's an interesting argument to say that the owners are the persons who take the decision, and they should be liable personally. Except companies don't always fail because of what actions the owners take. There are a lot of different factors involved, and it might prohibit an legitimate risk-taking behavior if you tell somebody that your house is on the line. I mean, so it's going to act as a deterrent to expanding the economy.
So the idea of risk-taking entrepreneurship will be discouraged.
Modify my argument. So we can categorize where the acts of that group of people were directly responsible for the loss, or where they were outside the purview of the act. We can obviously make a classification.
Right. But I think the point is being made is a bit wider than that. The point that is being made is that you've got to encourage risk-taking. You've got to encourage entrepreneurial activities. So you've got to do things that are slightly outside the safe zone. And if you don't have limited liability, you won't do it. And you won't have the engine of growth, is the point. So that is the economic rationale, really, that most people put forth, right? So that's just a thing we've got to remember, that is the economic rationale why there is limited liability for private and public companies. And now, of course, we know there's limited liability partnerships as well. So partnerships, too, can go for limited liability. And the essential idea is to do with encouraging entrepreneurial activity. That's underlying it. But you're right in saying that how can you actually divide up the fact that every act they do is one they should take responsibility for, because they're the only ones doing it. So you're quite right. That is the dilemma. Now, everything seemed to be rocking along pretty well around the 20th century, early part, until there was this big study done by this Berlin means. Everybody thought, yeah, cooperation is really cool, and next week we'll look at this article by Easterbrook and Fischel, which goes through all the economic arguments about, tomorrow, about a corporation. But Berlin means rocked the boat a bit. So I suppose the question is, and then it was followed up by Mace, who did another study on the 70s. So can someone tell us what Berlin means was actually pointing out about the idea of the corporation and management and ownership? Do you want to have a go?
So, we use data from various companies in the US, and they said that the shareholding has become
geographically widespread and very very diverse. So they said that the economic power, which which was present in the corporations during that time, could rival that of a modern state. They said that economic power versus political power was the main area of discussion of their paper, and they said that a state seeks to, in some aspects, to regulate the corporation, while the corporation is steadily becoming more powerful and makes every effort to avoid such regulation. And that's why they said that there's a growing separation between the executive management of major public companies and the increasingly diverse and remote shareholders.
Okay. All right. So a couple of points made there. The first is it was getting really difficult actually for the government to regulate the corporation. And the corporation wants to stay under the radar. They don't want to be regulated if they can help it, which is partly why they have all these codes. They want to regulate themselves. So that's the first thing. And the second point that's being made is the shareholding is no longer just this room or just this university or just Hyderabad. It's across all of India, across all of Southeast Asia. And that disparate shareholding means that it's very difficult for them to come together to try to police the managers of the company. So the managers basically aren't policed. And what they found is, the Berlin Means study, that's a 1932 study, found that a small block of shareholders, even if they have 5% of shares, can control the company. Because the other 95% are so spread out, they really don't have the interest, they don't have the information, and they don't have the ability to actually monitor the company and what the directors are doing. So they found that whereas we have this strange idea that all the shareholders go to a meeting, put their hand up and vote, it turns out that 5% of shareholders is the only one that the CEOs and managers have to please. And it's quite easy to make a deal with that 5%. So that's what they found. Also, they found that that 5% is often an institution. So it isn't just individuals, but it could be 3 banks. It could be 3 superannuation funds. It could be a couple of big shareholders, other big companies. So it's easier for them to actually control the management. So I want to ask you a question, which is, if you are a shareholder, which is 5%, are you going to go, and you know all the others are asleep or doing something else, the other 95%, are you going to go to a general meeting and vote? What are you going to do? How are you going to influence the CEOs? So, you know, the idea is, the usual idea is of a company. You go to a meeting, they pay millions and millions of dollars to hold one of these meetings. And now it's electronic, so everybody everywhere can come in and see what's happening at the meeting. Do you go to the meeting and there's an agenda and there's resolutions and you put your hand up and vote? Or you send your proxy? Or what would you do? Let's say you have 5% of shares in the company, and you and your friends, and you want to influence what these guys who are the CEOs and the CFO in the company are doing. How would you go about influencing them?
Does the proxy agent have the right to speak in the meetings?
The proxy.
The proxy agent has the right to speak in the meeting,
The proxy usually the proxy has given a vote.
but he doesn't have the right to speak in the board meeting.
Right, so what's the point you're making?
How is able to persuade the CEO?
Oh, right. Won't he just pick up the phone and say to these guys, listen guys, if you don't do what I want you to do, you're not going to be elected next time as directors, if one of them is a director. Or he's going to say, if you don't do what I want you to do, I'm not going to vote for your remuneration upgrade at the next election. So you better do it, otherwise, sayonara. Isn't that what he's going to do? He's going to pick up the phone. Is he going to actually vote? That's what institutions do. They don't go to vote. They don't fill a proxy form. It's too hard. They put pressure indirectly. So the point that I'm making here is the idea that a general meeting is such a big deal and that everybody goes in and fills their proxy forms is a bit weird. Anyway, I'm just making a point about the regulatory provisions we have. So to go back to your point that Berlin Means said, you also brought us to the actual view of Mace, or the conclusion of Mace in 1970. And what Mace says is that the board didn't know what they're doing. You know how the board of directors is supposed to actually, what the board is supposed to do as we know it is set the strategy for the company, decide all the major decisions. Apparently the board of directors were all drinking scotch. Apparently they don't have a clue. That's what Mace found. Big fat boys club didn't do anything, because how are they supposed to get on top of all that information and figure out what should happen next of some company that's diversifying from steel to textiles? And these guys don't want to give them power. They want to keep everything under their hat because they're managers. They want to make it as mysterious as possible so they won't lose their job. So Berlin Means were detecting those things, and Mace was reinforcing it. So on the bottom of page 8, it says that the business literature describes the classic function of a board as 3 important roles. 1, establishing basic objectives, corporate strategies, and board policies. 2, asking discerning questions. And 3, selecting the president or the chairman. So that's what the board is supposed to do. President, chairman, CEO. Now, instead, Mace found the board of directors of most large and medium-sized companies do not establish objectives, strategies, or policies. The roles is performed by company management. Outside directors and presidents are generally agreed that only management can and should have these responsibilities. So your non-executive directors basically aren't bothering with anything. They're just thinking, oh, you know, another 2 lakh per meeting, I'll go along, it's okay. You know, it's my friend anyway, and I can play and catch up with him. Haven't seen him since the last golf game. So that's the kind of culture that is developing. So they're saying that the second thing is that directors are supposed to ask discerning questions. But most of them felt that the board meetings are not really proper forums to ask any questions. So they never asked any questions, mainly because they most really didn't know what to ask, right? And also there's no liability attached to them at that time. So they just went along, had a nice time, and went home. And finally, they said that a president was not actually elected. Usually what happens is that the managing director also, or the CEO, also acted as the chairman, which means there's no person to actually check that. So they ran all the meetings. So these 2 guys run the company, and then when there's a general meeting, they also run that, and they report to themselves, which is very nice. nice and tight. So that is what Berlin-Means found, that the whole idea of the protections that we're supposed to have doesn't really happen in practice. And that was quite a big development that we learned. So, of course, as we know, the law is responsive. The law reacts to problems, usually after problems occurred. It's not usually proactive, but it does respond. So the 70s was completely a response, really, to these problems, which were articulated in several collapses. Before that, however, let's just talk about the key things that that was at that time important that this article raises. The first thing that the article raises is what your act is based on. Firstly, the act accepts independent directors and audit committees. And they're both really important things that's raised in the 70s. So I wanted to ask you, why do you think they think an audit committee is going to be useful? So the audit committee is on the first paragraph under developments in the 70s.
Clearance, what it is going in the company. They just provide what
issues regarding the financial
and they review the internal audit of the company and they'll just provide disclose.
Okay. All right. Do you want to just read that bit out that it says here?
Financial company department.
Provide a bridge between the external auditor and the main board. So the audit committee is in the company. There's an auditor outside who does the audit, but what they're saying is that the audit committee will then translate what the external auditor is saying, get the messages, and tell the board what's happening. So the audit committee is actually the middleman, the translator. Because, the board doesn't have all accountants. They have marketers, politicians, fashion models, wives. The board's made up of a whole heap of people. Some who are opportunistic, some who are there for skill, and some for contacts. So this is a middleman that is able to translate all that information. So the question then is, to have a middleman who translates the information, what kind of person do you need? Yeah, you need someone with a bit of financial experience.
See, the thing is that it is the responsibility or obligation of the holding company to provide all the information and voucher to the auditor, external auditor, on the statutory auditor. And if the company is unable to do so, then he is obliged, he is punished under the statute of the Companies Act or the Auditing Act. So it is the companies, big companies, appoint the internal auditor to provide the bridge to the external auditor and the management of the company. He provides all the vouchers, all the expenses to the external auditor or statutory auditor to audit that the company, audit the company, and thereafter it.
All right. So I'll tell you about this Australian case that really made a lot of good law, changed the practice completely. It's a case called Daniels and Anderson. So in that case, there was an audit firm that was appointed. The audit firm that was appointed, the auditor, the partner in the audit firm, was actually quite good friends with the company who was being audited, the CEO of the company that was being audited. They played golf together, of course. So the auditor came and audited the company. And he was auditing the company and he asked for a lot of information. The company didn't give it. Didn't give all the information because they wanted lots of things to hide. One of the main things they had to hide is that they had no proper system for checking what the foreign exchange department was doing. And there was a kook in the foreign exchange department who had invested so much money on foreign exchange dealings, and he wasn't disclosing it because he kept losing and losing and losing. This was during the 80s when the yen was hopelessly doing well compared to the Australian dollar. It was doing very well compared to the hopeless Australian dollar. So money was being lost. He didn't want to disclose it because he was terrified. And the processes in the company weren't clear to be able to get that information out. And they didn't really know. Anyway, the auditor was auditing the company, didn't find this information. But he thought there was something suspicious. So when they were playing golf, he told the CEO, mate, bit weird. Good swing, but bit weird. Let's have a beer. Now, mate, got to watch out. Don't want to spill the beans in front of the board, but a bit risky, a bit on your nose, bit. I think one of the guys is, ripping you off. So what does the chairman do? He says, thanks, that's great, I'll deal with it. The chairman, who is dealing with this, goes off, and what does he do? He says, yeah, it's all fine, we'll just deal with it. And the audit report comes in, nothing happens. The audit report is watered down because he's already warned him. And the company loses tremendous amount of money, right? It goes broke, and everybody is sued, including the auditor. So the auditor is sued, the company is sued, the directors are sued. Every single person is sued. The CEO is sued. So in that case, the question is, what is the role of the directors in supplying the information? Guess what? The directors should have supplied the information. They breached their duty. What is the role of the auditor who did the actual audit? He breached his duty because he shouldn't just be telling the general manager on a golf course what the problem is. He should be disclosing it to a board or to an audit committee. But if the audit committee consists of the CEO, is any news going to get back? No. So the lesson we have to learn from that is that the audit committee has got to be someone who is responsible. And the point that's made here is that the audit committee has to be someone who is independent directors, not executive directors. So does that make sense? So the important thing in that case that came out, which is going to come out in India in a huge way, is that people are not going to be interested in taking appointment as directors. Once there are a few cases that come out that hold that independent directors are actually liable for huge losses. What happened in Australia is after this case of Daniels versus Anderson, when non-executive directors were held liable because they sat around drinking gin. They were given a big batch of board papers and they just didn't really care because they just went to meetings, sat around and nodded. That's what they'd always done, and that's what they continued to do. After that particular decision, people really resisted becoming independent directors because being an independent director carried a duty. The duty is you understand what you're reading. So if you're a village idiot and don't understand accounting, too bad. You're still going to be guilty. You read everything, you go to a majority of meetings, and you participate. So the idea is that an audit committee should be an active one, should be an effective one. To do that, we've got to have all these other things happening. So that's the point I was raising. I agree with you that the process that the company's got to give information, the auditor's got to provide an audit report and provide it back to the company. But I'm just wondering about actually that happening.
Just to understand, because what you're saying is that because you're making the audit committee animal on which you can put the blame later on, less and less people will be interested in being part of it.
I'm actually talking about independent directors completely. right now,
In general, irrespective of the audit committee, the liability will be
independent directors generally, because right now the idea is an independent director is supposed to participate in the governance of the company actively. That is what is supposed to be, is in your legislation.
Just to put it in perspective of the current Indian laws, and I mean it's coincidence that the author also mentions it, that because America was becoming a highly litigious society, that was one of the reasons they thought of having audit committees so that labor relies on their legal liability. Now, leading it to the discussion we just now had at 123, under Indian law, under section 177 or 178 of Audit Committee that we have in the 2013 Act, majority of members of the audit committee have to be independent.
That's exactly right.
So then I think, if you agree that there is a angle on which you want to play now, I think it makes it very difficult for independent directors.
Exactly. Completely true. So the point that is exactly right, that idea that an audit committee has to be independent directors has been embodied within the Act is the point. It's exactly right. Thank you. Is that all right, everyone? And also it's a bit scary there's going to be greater awareness campaigns for directors about what it actually means to be a director and how they can fulfill their duties. That's going to take time. But you're quite right. One of the things, as the article says, that drove these actions is the litigious society, but also insurance policies. Insurance policies meant deep pockets, so you could sue everyone because there's money to be made. So usually you won't sue a director because the director is going to be only coming with empty pockets. He's not going to have anything in his name. He's going to have everything in a trust. So, or she, sorry, got to give women a fair go. Women too can be as sneaky as men. Right, it's not fair just to say only men are sneaky. Okay, so women too can make sure that their assets are safely secure put away from creditors. So the director who takes the job isn't going to have, or an auditor who accepts the job isn't going to have any money in their name. But what they do have is insurance policies. And the insurance policies are going to cover a lot of damage. So the more that insurance gets in the game, the more litigation also increases. So it's like a catch-22. All right. Now I just wanted to ask you, there's a bit of discussion here about the dual board and the single board, and that it didn't actually take off. So the European position of having the dual board wasn't really popular in the UK. Can you explain why? Like we had, firstly, who's on the dual board? Or what they call a two-tier board, I think, in this article. So who's on the two-tier board? Employees and also shareholders. Okay, so you're supposed to have these two different levels. So you include other members, not just shareholders. You include employees. Why didn't the UK directors really like this model? I guess you've got to come back to these guys and ask what would they like. Would you guys, you're the directors, right, in the UK. There's a one-tier board. You're the directors, and you just decide on a board of directors what happens. The UK wants to introduce a two-tier board. So there's one tier, and there's another tier with employees, with shareholders. Instead, you guys can just listen to shareholders, but they want two levels. Why wouldn't you like that? Interference. Exactly. So it's very simple. They just don't want further scrutiny. And also, the UK model is very much shareholder-centric. Whereas the US, the EU model is very much stakeholder-centric. So you wouldn't want it because you just want to do what you do, which is basically take care of your own pockets. Right. So, so the aim of the two-tier board is controlling management, and you wouldn't want that.
Powers mentioned says supervisory board, which was one of the board. Second tier had the power to hire the members of the executive board. That's just taking the powers away to power, depending on the appreciate.
Yeah. You wouldn't want to be fired, would you?
So the supervisory board generally has the power to hire and fire the members from the executive board. That was the secret way.
Okay.
Supervisory section, and it deals with the management section.
Yeah. So that is in Germany, and that's the one that's being eradicated. Okay. So we proceed now to the 1980 collapses, and the main point, I suppose, here is, is that the neoliberal ideology of Margaret Thatcher and Reagan took hold in the 80s in the UK and the US. What I mean by that is that the free market is fantastic, that everything is perfectly allocated by companies. Companies should take lots and lots of risk, and they should be responsible for increasing profit. That's sort of the neoliberal ideology. Also, the company is the best allocator of resources, so let's sell all the government enterprises off to companies because they do a better job, because all the governments are just sitting around twiddling their thumbs and they're useless. That ideology took hold in the UK and US in the 80s, and it came to Australia a bit later. In the 70s, 80s. It came to Australia a bit later. So that ideology meant there was lots and lots of companies that had come up. So what was the result? Would you like to tell us about some of the collapses that ensued?
Basically, there was a lot of power in there was a lot of risk, and eventually there were failures, and there was no much regulation, so there was a lot of rampant exploitation of the shareholders. As a result, the corporation would go bankrupt, the creditors wouldn't get much out of it. So that was a problem of giving so much liberty and giving them so much leeway to take risks.
Okay, so hand in hand with taking risk also was fraud. So they took risk, they bribed people, they put money in other hands, there was related party transactions, conflict of interest, all that happened because of lack of oversight. All right, so that seemed to be the result of those collapses. And as much as entrepreneurship was encouraged, it sometimes went overboard, is what the point that's being made is. And there was lots and lots of inquiries that were undertaken in all the countries. The main point they bring out here is that's what resulted in institutional investors actually coming to the fore. So institutional investors and proxy votes, shareholder proxy votes, is what all these inquiries decided had to be used to control these companies. Remember, we have that same thing as Berlin means. We have this disparate, diverse shareholding. The only real group is institutional investors. So let's force them to do something. So proxy votes. If you can't come, you can give a proxy vote. Let's force people, the company, to accept proxy votes. Make it compulsory. Let's try to force institutional investors to actually vote. So they're trying, the government's trying to get somebody else to go and watch the company. That's what the legislative move was about. Okay, so the main point really moving on from that is, and the main point they come out with here is the government's trying to get all the private bodies to try to do something, and the private bodies are starting to develop their own codes of conduct. And as it says here on just the paragraph before the subheading on page 12, the US Treadway Commission had been formed in 1985 to consider fraudulent corporate financial reporting. and its first report led to the creation of the Committee of Sponsoring Organizations of the Tradeway Commission, a private sector initiative to encourage executive management and boards towards effective business activities. So what's happening here is the law seems to be trying to delegate some of its duty to private organizations. The government is saying, we can't do this by law, it's too bloomin' hard. So you private organizations try to do something, and they're trying to develop codes. And that's the first step before they talk about all the codes that eventuated. So can I ask you, what is the Cadbury code? That was the big code. I like the other Cadbury myself, but this is Adrian Cadbury. So what is that code recommending? There are just some points, and I just wanted to ask you, do they resonate with the concerns of the 2013 Act?
Yeah, basically, another point is the audit committee should have more independent members.
This is on page,
When
right, thank you, 12. Yeah?
and the regulation, so basically, what it wants to do is it wants to make sure that the shareholders are not exploited, the creditors are not exploited by the board of members, and those who have passed. That is what is crux of the entire report. But the problem with this report, it has only persuasion power, whereas in US they were legitimate laws. If you violate them, you could be penalized or even sent to jail. So that is the only drawback of this report. But this actually was this was the icebreaker. It led to it showed the world that that there are a lot of problems in the way the corporation works right now. So it was followed by various reports in various other European countries as well as in the US. That is what was the ramification, and that is what was mentioned in the report.
Right. So the main points, as has been said, it's not mandated as in the US, it's voluntary, but you're pointing out that it's audit committee, it's having responsibilities between CEO and chairman, having a remuneration committee, having independent directors actually more active, are all the things that are proposed in the Cadbury report, which is in your legislation, which is in all legislation pretty much. So I wanted to then take you and ask you, so that's the first thing, corporate governance principles of who can be there. So it's all sort of who can participate in management. But then the really difficult thing is accounting. You have in your act the true and fair view, right? That's what the accounting is supposed to represent, true and fair view. But what does that mean is the next question, which is why accounting standards become important. In big companies, you can't compare the accounts of one company to the other. So on page 13, I suppose, it talks about the US Business Roundtable and the Statement on Corporate Governance being updated. The Accepted Accounting Principles. The GAP. The accounting principles that are being proposed. So once again, what they're trying to do is get one approach. So if you look at your legislation, it is saying that the accounting principles that have been developed by, I think it's what's it called, Financial Council or something. Right. Right. So the accounting principles developed by another organization shall apply in the Act. So the Act itself doesn't develop it, but it's just saying, go there, and we agree with them. So it's trying to actually bring in, sorry, I can look up the law, but I think you can do the same. No. It wasn't a disturbance at all. All right. Let me just go on and go to the next thing and ask you about the growth of the global corporation and how the response has been to that. This is the 21st century and reaction to the corporate collapses of Enron and so forth. What's happened since then? It seems to be, I think what's coming out here is that there should be a distinction between listed companies and unlisted companies. So there's more and more problems, and listed companies who are listed on the stock exchange then have hitting more people. They're affecting so much more people adversely. So the idea is, let's all use the stock exchange rules, the listing rules, to try to regulate those companies even further. So unlisted companies have the Act, and listed companies also have to comply with further instructions. So they're trying to differentiate listed companies, unlisted companies, small companies, and giving them all different levels of regulation. Now, I just wanted to ask you to think about. Oh, before I go, I'll leave the tricky question. I'll leave the question, but I just wanted to take you through the UK approach. The UK approach is to look at the duty of the director under Section 172, and the duty is to remember the old duty was just company as a whole. So let me just go back a minute. Let me just put that one, the Australian approach. So the English old approach is when a board of directors act, they only have to really take care of the companies, of the shareholders, sorry. It says they've got to act in the interest of the company as a whole. And what does that mean, company as a whole? It's supposed to mean shareholders. I don't know how they even think it's possible, but shareholders is one big fat, like, it's like a Kabuli chana or something, like a big bowl with, you know, all these lumps, but you have to think of it as a whole. You can't think of each chana as an individual. So in Australia, there have been lots of cases where the directors have thought about the interests of one group, and they've been told, wrong, it's the interest as a whole. As long as they can say that the interests of that one group is also consistent with the interest as a whole, then they're okay. But they've got to make sure that when they actually describe their decision, it is consistent with this idea that it's not just prioritizing one particular group. Except, of course, in insolvency. Then you've got to take creditors into account. If there's a suspicion of insolvency. Once there's a suspicion of insolvency, of course, creditors' interests come up, and you've got to take them into account. So the Australian law is really old-fashioned, and it only sticks with that. Creditors and shareholders. However, the UK approach has changed. And the UK approach under Section 172 is actually very similar to the Indian approach. The UK approach says that the duty is to promote the success of the company for the benefit of the members as a whole. That's what we know. But it goes on to say, and in doing so have regard to, and these are the points that are important. Firstly, it's saying it can't just be short-term, it's got to be long-term company decisions. Can I ask you, why would a director be thinking of short-term rather than long-term?
Maybe shortage of capital.
Shortage of capital? Okay, so the immediate needs of the company?
That'd be from the more from personal motive perspective, and he just wants to make money and leave.
Okay, yeah, make money and leave, get a good bonus package and move on. All bad people get promoted, don't they? So that's what he wants to do to another company. So the short term is acting in own interests. So maybe just have a big profit, have a big dividend for shareholders and move on, because he gets a big bonus then. Okay, so they're saying you can't just do that. Interests of employees, they've got all these things, customers, community, environment, high standards of business conduct. So the Act seems to be moving away from that Salomon case and even from all these cases. And this is a reflection or a reaction to the community losing out. The Australian approach you've already seen, it's in the dark ages. The South African approach is quite modern. It is actually looking at sustainability reporting and putting it into the Act. Integrated sustainability reporting. And it says that the audit committee should actually recommend to the board to engage an external assurance provider and about the integrated report. The idea here is having another person auditing the audit report to see if they're actually complying with the integrated reporting requirements, which is a code. What an integrated report is it's trying to incorporate economic as well as social and environmental impact. So it's not only about money, it's also about how many employees might have lost their jobs or might have been employed. It's also about any potential environmental degradation, any potential losing licenses, getting licenses. So it's reporting on environmental matters. It's a bit more significant. So if they're actually producing goods and profit is dropped, but they're producing goods that's using recyclable materials that's more expensive, they can put it in their integrated reporting to give a bigger picture of decision making.
Just to confirm, so this provision is
It's in the Act.
It's in the Act, but this is not mandatory, it seems. This is directly.
It's a code.
Because it says the audit committee should review.
That's right.
Should. The best way to draft maybe, but...
No, you're right. So what it's doing is it's using I should have explained a bit more. The integrated reporting is actually an international code which has been put together internationally by auditors. I'll tell you the exact association. So what this is doing is it's saying in its Act, you should adopt that particular code principles at any particular time and appoint an auditor. So yes, it's a good point you've raised. There are two approaches as was pointed out before. One is the US approach, which was mandating legislation, so mandating conduct. Something's right or something's wrong, you're guilty or you're not guilty, you've got to do this or you're not going to do this. And that was very much the 70s, 60s, 70s approach. However, the other approach is comply or explain. So you have to comply with the law or you have to say why you didn't.
It's a UK approach.
That's the UK approach. And that is very much to do with self-regulation. You are trying to adopt codes, you're trying to comply, but if there's a difficulty, you're telling the people who matter. So all the codes of conduct are not mandated. They are voluntary. So this is a voluntary approach, which is in the Act, but it's encouraged. It's not too bad. So you've got your Act, which says that a director shall act in good faith, but it also says company, employees, shareholders, community and environment. So it's listing aspirational goals, but it isn't listing the process for getting towards those aspirational goals as the King report does. So it's just a thing to bear in mind. However, I wanted to ask you how this might be interpreted in the future. And I had a problem that I thought you could think about. So a public company decides to diversify its activities and enter into a contract for the storage of toxic chemicals near Nalsar. This is supported by your ambitious government, state government, because it'll increase investment in the state, it'll increase employment. So the directors want to do it because they're going to get a lot of money from doing it, a lot of jobs. There's a huge market out there. All the Western countries are creating incredible amount of toxic chemicals that have got to be dumped somewhere, and India is a good dumping spot. And Nalsar is so beautiful, no one would even notice. So, the question is, you're supposed to advise the directors about how this act, this section, should be influencing their decision.
Means establishment of toxic industry near the Nalsar University might be a bad responsible and might be create a bad valor around the Nalsar University. How it is the director of the company delegated the duty of their community at that time.
So you're saying, sorry. So would you like to advise the directors? What is your advice?
It's better for them to shift the company to other outskirt places, not to the nearby Nalsar University or somewhere else where there is a barren land and there are no deciding there are no community decide at that place.
Okay, very interesting point made. Nalsar students, very argumentative. Nalsar students, quite rich. Nalsar students, no lawyers. So what's being said there is go far away in the rural areas where they don't know any lawyers. They're not rich and they can't complain. Is that the point? No, I'm just wondering. No, of course not. But I'm just wondering, is that behind your decision?
Not exactly.
No. But it's a good suggestion. But isn't every part of India populated?
There might be some places that it doesn't impact the community.
Okay. Yes. Would you like to say something?
First thing you should look at is probably, no matter where you're situating the pipeline or the chemicals, it should be the employees that you're employing to undertake these tasks, and the health and safety standards for them should be met. And apart from that, there should be regular environmental checks to make sure that the toxicity doesn't infect the nearby regions, and to carry out and to comply with some government regulations for disposal of waste and such other regulations to ensure that the harmful chemicals don't enter your water pipelines or aren't too close to populace.
Okay, great. So the point being made there is cover your back. Make sure that you tick all the boxes and you're not liable. So you're getting someone else to say environmental impact statement, A-OK. You're getting someone else to say community study, they're OK. Employees, occupational health and safety, considered. So the point that's being made there is the director is actually deciding to go and get all those interest groups, in some way delegating the authority, to get all of those interest groups' consent to continue. Right? So when, to use the proverbial term, the shit hits the fan, you can cover your back and say, hey, look, I went through all the processes at the time and I'm not liable. Okay, so you've raised two interesting points. Go to somewhere where they don't complain and do this, cover your back. All right? So spoken like good lawyers, right? You don't really think of protecting the community or an ethical stance here. You're just thinking of how you can kind of do it and take the money. Let's find a loophole to do it. Fascinating. Now, I know you are a corporate lawyer, at least inside. So tell us, take the opposite view and tell us why we shouldn't go ahead with this option. the directors.
I was going to take, I was going to agree with actually.
Yeah, go for your natural tendency.
Yeah, I was going to talk about how within the duties there isn't a specific hierarchy that's placed which says, okay, environment must go before profits or profits must go before the interests of the community. So there's no specific hierarchy placed.
Yeah.
And there aren't really any standards put in place in the Companies Act which say, okay, directors must make sure they comply with this particular regulation. That might be part of a different act, but it's not part of the Companies Act in the sense that it doesn't impose a liability on the directors as long as they've essentially made sure they've complied with all the regulations put forth by the state. So in light of the fact that the government is supporting the initiative, the government wants to increase investment, it wants to increase employment, and also in light of the fact that there aren't specific standards, objective standards that the Companies Act requires a director to fulfill, as long as the company, ensures that it takes all the clearances, the director should be good. I mean, as an ethical stand, maybe you could say, listen, try to make sure you don't harm the community too much. But in terms of the liability that could be placed on a director, I think a superficial sort of compliance with the laws is good enough to escape liability.
Thank you. Bit louder.
Government was holding it, so a part of the stakeholders who are looking at might be worried. But if you look at long-term impact, we are already an established community. This might not be bad publicity about what kind of work the company does invest in, so that might affect the branding of the paper. And also, if you're also looking at other stakeholders such as customers and what they want to do, what they expect from the environment. Those factors might
Okay. So the view being that you're placing a bit more emphasis on the environmental and the community, and you're saying there might be long-term problems that ensue. All right. Thank you. Yeah.
Very small point, just that what Shita listed, the requirements were not just to cover your back, and they were not just superficial things that you can do and get away. Because I'm just reading the law here, 66 subsection 3 says, director of the company shall exercise his duty with due and reasonable care, skill and diligence, and shall exercise independent judgment. The moment you put all these obligations, and why I'm raising it here, because once one of our clients just questioned that, why do we pay you lawyers so much to do due diligence? We can do without it. So my partner just got back, so it's not just because you like paying us, it's your duty to pay us, and then you have to show him the second under which. So the point I'm making is that all the lists that she gave, they can be long. Let's not presume that because it's a environmentally risky proposition, there would always be a disaster. So as long as the director can show, talking very restricted to the discussion we are having, that he exercises due care, and that he can show by conducting all the diligences, environmental impact statements, etc., and other that as long as he is able to prove that he was running the company professionally, I don't think there should be.
Right. Okay, I just use the term covering your back as a facetious one because clearly it again is the knowledge at the time may be quite different to the knowledge that one might think or suspect. So when you talk about reasonable, the points you made, act with due skill and diligence, take reasonable care, avoid a conflict of interest, act in an honest manner, those four duties, what is reasonable skill is what matters. And also I might add that if it's such a dangerous thing, just doing an environmental impact statement might not be sufficient.
If it is negative, then acting, deciding not to start.
No, I know, but it mightn't be sufficient even if you're just doing that. And the choice of who you decide. I mean, who you decide to advise you and so forth might also matter. But I think you're all saying something that's really important, and you're saying that perhaps the ability of the courts to really hold place any further responsibility on directors is limited. I think you're saying that the reading of the section is going to be pretty a black letter. It's not going to be reading it in a too deep way. So it isn't going to be reading it in a way that's against entrepreneurship, for example. So anyway, it's a good point that you've raised. Does that kind of, I just wanted to get you to think about that. There's another problem that's a little bit more far-fetched that I put down, which is to do with Indian snacks, my favourite, muruku and, all those sorts of yummy things, and responding instead to these alcohol mixes, which everyone, I'm sure it's really popular here. It's like sugar water, you don't even know, and you can have like 15 and drop dead. No, you don't drop dead, you just wake up rather sick the next day. Anyway, and it's 60% sugar, and of course there's widespread dangers of diabetes and health costs. It's everywhere. That knowledge is everywhere about the dangers of diabetes. And I'm just asking the question, should the directors watch out, or is it all right? So for this, I might just take the liberty of dividing the class in the middle there and making this group argue that directors shouldn't go ahead, just to make you think of the other side, and this group to argue that the directors should go ahead. Can you choose one person to sort of put your first, you can have, Queen's Counsel with support, or whatever you call it here. So, do you want to discuss that for, say, 7.5 minutes? And please tell us what your conclusion will be.
that the alcohol is not what as it if you are a regular consumption of alcohol, it will be affect. But if you are not a regular consumption of alcohol, it will not affect your health and anymore. And talking about the conservative household, that is, they are going for that. They think that the alcohol is the substances where all the households were taking it, and going going with this, that we don't have any specification that this particular group has taken this substance, this product, and this particular doesn't have that particular substance.
See, the first thing is that they said that we are. First thing which I want to revert is what the opposition has said, that we are having a conservative society. So,
don't revert, just give your argument.
So,
advice.
See, the product is having 60% sugar and it is mixed with alcohol. So, if it is having demand in the society, that's why people are buying it. And the other thing is we are giving the warning in the package that if you will consume that, it will affect your health. So if people are buying then it is on them whether they want to consume or not. So it is not.
Would you advise them that you sell it?
Yes, we'll give a
We
warning
put
and
all
then
the
we'll sell it.
ingredients in the package.
So basically we have been told the 3 points: the legal claims, the loss of brand value, and the moral claim. So we'll start with the legal claim. First, that there is a certain health standard that's been prescribed by the FSSA. So if we are following that health standard, so there is no reason for the legality to come up at all. And we'll make sure that the content is provided in the product is within that prescribed parameter. Second, the issue of also in addition we will be providing a nutritional label along with the warning label. So those who are already with diseases like diabetes and so on and so forth would understand that this is not a product for them. As for its possibility of causing diabetes, that's an outrightly like arbitrary claim. There is a number of reasons that cause diseases like diabetes. Unless you can establish a direct causal link, there's really no liability on the part of government. And second, the brand value. They said there will be a loss of brand value if we engage in this. The only reason the company got into it in the first place is because there was a rise in demand. So that's adding to our brand value, and that will cater to the needs of our consumers instead of shying away from it. And third, we have the moral claim, which is the fact that I think the policing that is happening that alcoholism or shouldn't be allowed is like excessive thing given that the market.
Not the normative one, how you always love doing it.
Yeah, that's
but
the-
on the market reality, that what I think the point what they made was that somewhere we need to appreciate is that Indian customer, there is a considerable set of customer who would not like to associate with the company which produces alcohol based products. Right?
If the Indian customer is going for and buying it, doesn't that mean they want to associate?
Yes, from the last 10 decades.
I
There
mean,
are numerous companies that sell alcohol. They're not exactly bad. You have
are they also producing chips and other products?
yes, and actually this assumption that isn't very justified. Indian snacks are often actually very often eaten with alcoholic beverages. And this is not just a recent trend. This has been something that has been very long lasting. So in fact these might be
No, but
very
what about those who don't drink alcohol at all? This association that this snack will go very well with alcohol will further and dissuade them from buying your snack at all.
I'm saying that why is it firstly present in conservative also that alcohol is predominantly a bad decision.
But that's what they're saying. Yes, it is. That's why I would not like to associate. See, one thing is you challenge it. How we not doing it. Right? This bias is that. They are corporate lawyers working in the market. They are saying this is how it is. And because it is like that, therefore you should be aware of it. You should be labeled as someone who also produces alcohol, which is not good in Gandhi.
using.
And at the end of the day, is the customer
do that to limit risk is obviously through a subsidiary. And the point that's being made is perhaps it's not the role of the company to control this kind of issue. It's a role of a government through warnings. And the company is a private entity that's for profit, not really for taking care of the health of the community. That's the sort of point they're making. Which is quite interesting. It's exactly the points that you guys were making before, really, isn't it? The idea of compliance. As in cough medicine. So what's your decision, Judge? There goes India's growing economy. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. It's lovely. Thank you so much. Oh, do you want to give your... Oh, you don't have to give your... It'd get too hard to give your reason. You just like it. Which is the way justice works.
Okay, so I take attendance in the meanwhile. Please also then collect my attendance.
Oh, okay, you collect. All right. So I just wanted to tell you about next time. Oh, yes, about next time, and that is... Oh, yes, sorry, we didn't get to that. Yeah, so next time I thought we could talk about this article that I've included, which is by Easterbrook and Fischel, and the reason for that is it goes through how a corporation works, who does the monitoring, why is it a really good way to allocate resources, who takes the risk. So we'll be discussing that article, plus we'll be discussing what's in your materials here. which is to do with the different theoretical aspects of corporate governance. So the stakeholder, the agency theories. So we'll be looking at the readings in your book plus Easterbrook and Fischel article. Additionally, I would like to, I didn't put it in. That's funny. Anyway, I'm going to have a little discussion on women on boards next week. So what I'd like you to think about is this question for next week, tomorrow, which is Ravi Suri is a director of Surium Limited. He objects to the appointment of Padma Jivan, financial analyst, to being appointed to the board of directors under section 149. He's basically against a woman being appointed to the position as required by the section. And you're asked, you have to assume that the company is supposed to comply with 159 because it's that particular type of company, and you're supposed to advise the board. Sorry, you're supposed to advise Ravi. One group will advise Ravi, the other group will advise Padma. So think about both legal and economic and market arguments that might exist for supporting this. So the questions is Easterbrook and Fischel article, the stakeholder, and that particular problem, as well as some discussion questions that's on questions 1 to 6 in your readings. As far as your question about the problems, the essay topics, as I'd mentioned last time, I'm happy for you to design your own essay topic, but I did put down 4 potential essay topics on the first page of this handout. The first is the initiative by the Indian Companies Act in regulating CSR is brave but foolish. Discuss with reference to the legislation and 2 case studies which illustrate your argument. The second topic is the provisions to mandate for independent directors on company boards in the Companies Act has to be examined within the context of the Indian market structure and politics. Critically discuss and incorporate recommendations to strengthen this provision. The third is the protection for minority shareholders included in the Companies Act is unlikely to be effective in corporatized state-owned enterprises. Discuss. In your answer, consider what further steps may be necessary to make these protections effective. The fourth is the role of institutional shareholders in India has the potential to enhance the performance of corporations. Assess and in your answer, consider how this potential can be enhanced. So they're the 4 possible questions. We will cover most of them during the week, but you can also come and talk to me about your own question that you would like to do. Otherwise, see you later.